The morning mist clung to the frozen fields of the Ardennes like a death shroud. December 16, 1944. Sergeant Klaus Müller pressed his face against the frost-covered periscope of his Tiger I tank, watching American positions through the haze. His breath came in sharp puffs inside the cramped commander's cupola, each exhale a reminder that winter had arrived early and merciless. "Fuel pressure dropping again, Klaus," whispered Corporal Hans Zimmer from the driver's position, his voice barely audible over the rumbling Maybach engine. The same engine that had carried them through 3 years of hell across Europe, from the steppes of Russia to the bocage of Normandy. Klaus's gloved hand trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of what he knew. 3 days ago, during a hasty repair under enemy fire, they had jerry-rigged a fuel hose with wire and prayers. Now, as Operation Watch on the Rhine commenced Hitler's last desperate gamble, that makeshift repair threatened everything. Below, in the hull, Private Erich Hoffmann hunched over his radio, tears freezing on his cheeks as he clutched a crumpled letter from home. His wife had written about their son's first steps Klaus knew Erich might never witness. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Germany's most feared weapon, the mighty Tiger tank that had struck terror into Allied hearts from Leningrad to Cannes, could be stopped cold by something as simple as a missing fuel hose. The forest erupted with the thunder of artillery. Operation Watch on the Rhine had begun, and with it, Klaus Müller's final test of loyalty, sacrifice, and the terrible mathematics of survival. The Tiger tank had been Klaus's salvation and his curse. 3 years earlier, fresh from the Panzer training school at Munster, he had been assigned to Schwer Panzerabteilung 501, believing he would help forge Hitler's thousand-year Reich. The reality proved far different than the propaganda posters. His first kill haunted him still, a Soviet T-34 outside Leningrad, its crew burning alive as they tried to escape. Klaus had watched through his optics as a Russian boy, no older than his own brother back in Bavaria, stumbled from the wreckage, his uniform on fire. The memory came back every time he closed his eyes, mixing with the screams that echoed across the frozen battlefield. Hans Zimmer carried different ghosts. Before the war, he had been a mechanic in his father's garage in the Rhineland, dreaming of building racing cars. Now his gentle hands, once meant to heal engines, had learned to coax death from machinery. The Tiger's 88mm gun had claimed 43 enemy tanks under his driving, each one a family destroyed, each one a piece of his soul sacrificed to the war machine. Erich Hoffmann was the youngest, barely 19, married just before deployment. His radio crackled with desperate calls from other German units scattered across the Ardennes. Tiger 131 respond. Tiger 205, do you copy? Each silent response marked another crew that would never return home. Erich had stopped answering most calls weeks ago, unable to bear delivering death sentences to men he'd shared cigarettes with just days before. The fuel hose problem had started during their retreat from Normandy. Under intense American artillery fire, they'd lost their main fuel line to shrapnel. Hans had improvised a replacement using parts salvaged from a destroyed Panzer IV, but the connection was fragile, held together by wire and determination. Each bump, each sharp turn stressed the makeshift repair further. Hey viewers, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below telling us what country you're watching from. We love connecting with history enthusiasts from around the world. Now, as they prepared for what Wehrmacht propaganda called the final offensive, Klaus faced an impossible choice. Should he report the mechanical failure and risk his crew being reassigned to a hopeless infantry assault? Or should he remain silent and hope their Tiger would hold together long enough to make a difference? The weight of command had aged him beyond his 24 years. Each decision carried the lives of his men, and increasingly, Klaus wondered if survival itself had become a form of betrayal of the dead who had trusted him to lead them home. The offensive began with the roar of 800 German tanks rolling through the Ardennes, but Klaus's Tiger was already falling behind. The improvised fuel line leaked precious gasoline with every mile, leaving a telltale trail in the snow that could guide enemy fighters straight to them. "We're losing fuel faster now," Hans reported, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "At this rate, we'll be empty before we reach the American lines." Klaus made his first fateful decision. Instead of following their assigned route with the main attack, He ordered a detour through a small Belgian village called Malmedy. Intelligence reports suggested an American fuel depot there. If they could capture it, they might salvage their mission. What Klaus didn't know was that his childhood friend, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, commanding another Tiger nearby, had intercepted their radio transmission. Friedrich had his own demons. Once Klaus's closest confidant, he had been promoted rapidly through the ranks not for tactical brilliance, but for his unwavering loyalty to Nazi ideology. The war had transformed him from Klaus's protector into his potential executioner. Friedrich knew that unauthorized route changes were tantamount to desertion, punishable by immediate field execution. As Klaus's Tiger limped toward Malmedy, they encountered a scene that would shatter Eric's remaining innocence. American prisoners, hands raised, stood in a snow-covered field. SS troops from Kampfgruppe paper were already there, their panzers forming a deadly semicircle. Klaus watched in horror as the SS commander raised his pistol. "Don't look," Klaus whispered to Eric, but it was too late. The boy had already seen the massacre begin. Unarmed American soldiers cut down in cold blood. 84 men murdered in what would become known as the Malmedy massacre. Eric vomited inside his helmet, his wife's letter falling into the mess. "This isn't what we're fighting for," he sobbed. "This isn't what she's waiting for me to come home from." Hans, usually the peacemaker, turned his gentle eyes hard as steel. "We can't be part of this, Klaus. We can't." But Klaus faced an impossible choice. Intervening would mean turning their guns on fellow Germans, marking them all as traitors. Remaining silent made them accomplices to murder. In that moment of paralysis, their fuel hose finally gave way completely. Gasoline poured onto the snow like blood, and Friedrich Weber's Tiger emerged from the tree line, its gun trained directly on them. Through the radio came Friedrich's voice, cold and unrecognizable. "Tiger 267, you are under arrest for desertion and failure to follow operational orders." Before we continue with this intense story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. We're working hard to reach 1,000 subscribers and share more incredible historical stories like this one with you. The network Klaus had built, trust between his crew, friendship with Friedrich, faith in their cause, was crumbling around them. Stranded without fuel, witness to atrocities, and now facing court-martial or worse, Klaus realized that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not against the enemy, but against the darkness within your own ranks. The standoff lasted exactly 47 seconds. Klaus had counted each one, watching Friedrich's gun barrel centered on their disabled Tiger. Then American P-47 Thunderbolts screamed overhead, their machine guns stitching death across the snow-covered field. Friedrich's Tiger exploded in a ball of orange flame as rockets found their mark. Klaus watched his childhood friend burn, the boy who had taught him to fish in the Isar River now reduced to smoke and twisted metal. There was no time to mourn. The same aircraft were banking for another attack run. "Abandoned tank!" Klaus screamed, but Eric was frozen at his radio, listening to desperate calls from German units being slaughtered across the Ardennes. The boy's mind had finally snapped under the weight of witnessing the massacre and now Friedrich's death. Hans grabbed Eric bodily, dragging him from the burning Tiger as 50 caliber rounds punched through their armor like paper. They dove into a shell crater just as their ammunition exploded, the concussion throwing them deeper into the frozen earth. For 3 hours, they huddled in that crater while the battle raged overhead. Klaus held Eric as the boy wept, no longer the eager young soldier who had married his sweetheart just months before. Hans methodically cleaned his rifle with hands that no longer shook. The gentle mechanic had found a terrible calm in accepting their doom. As darkness fell, they heard American voices approaching. Klaus faced his final impossible choice: surrender and likely face execution as war criminals associated with the SS massacre, or fight with their small arms against overwhelming odds. That's when Eric made the choice for all of them. Standing up in the crater, hands raised, he called out in broken English, "We surrender! We are not SS. We have wounded." The approaching Americans were paratroopers from the 101st Airborne, led by Staff Sergeant Mike O'Malley from Boston. O'Malley had lost half his squad to German fire that morning and had every reason to shoot the 3 tank crewmen on sight. But something in Eric's voice, the desperate, broken quality of a boy calling for his mother, stayed O'Malley's hand. Through a translator, the American learned about the fuel hose failure, the witnessed massacre, and Friedrich's attempt to arrest them. "You're saying you tried to stop the SS?" O'Malley asked Klaus directly. Klaus stared at the American sergeant, a man probably his own age, and made a decision that would haunt him forever. "No," he said quietly. "We failed to stop them. We were cowards when courage mattered most." In that moment of brutal honesty, the mighty Tiger tank's true failure was revealed. It wasn't the missing fuel hose that had stopped them cold. It was the absence of moral courage when evil walked freely among their ranks. The prisoner of war camp at Camp Atterbury, Indiana, became Klaus Müller's monastery of penance. For 18 months after Germany's surrender, he worked in the camp's motor pool, his mechanical expertise now serving to repair American vehicles. His gentle hands, once trained to operate instruments of death, found redemption in the honest work of maintenance. Erich Hoffmann never spoke again. The young radio operator who had once chattered endlessly about his wife's letters sat in silence, staring at photographs that would never be updated. The army psychiatrists called it combat fatigue, but Klaus knew better. Erich had seen too much truth about human nature in too short a time. When he was finally repatriated to Germany in 1947, Erich's wife met him at the train station in Munich. Klaus watched from a distance as she embraced a husband who could no longer remember how to love. Hans Zimmer chose differently. The former mechanic volunteered for every work detail, every construction project, as if constant motion could outrun his memories. In the camp workshops, he met Technical Sergeant Joseph Martinez, a Mexican-American mechanic from New Mexico who had lost his own brother to a German 88mm gun near Bastogne. Funny thing about machines, Martinez told Hans one day as they rebuilt a Jeep engine together. They don't care about the color of your skin or which flag you salute. They just need someone who understands how they work. Their friendship became the first genuine human connection any of Klaus's crew had experienced since the war began. Martinez taught Hans about American jazz music. Hans shared stories of the Black Forest where he'd grown up. Neither man spoke directly about the war, but both understood they were building something new from the wreckage of their former selves. The truth about the Tiger tank's actual performance in the Ardennes offensive emerged through intelligence debriefings. Of the 600 Tiger tanks that began Operation Watch on the Rhine, fewer than 50 remained operational after 2 weeks. Not from enemy action primarily, but from mechanical failures, fuel shortages, and logistical collapse. Klaus learned that their fuel hose problem had been epidemic across the entire Tiger fleet. Rushed production, inadequate materials, and hasty field repairs had made the legendary tank more dangerous to its own crews than to the enemy. The propaganda machine had hidden these failures, preferring myths of invincible superweapons to the mundane reality of engineering incompetence. But the deeper failure was moral. During his debriefings with American intelligence officers, Klaus met Major David Rosenberg, a Jewish-American lawyer from New York whose parents had fled Nazi Germany in 1938. Rosenberg could have treated Klaus as just another war criminal, but instead he probed the German's conscience with surgical precision. "You say you were powerless to stop the massacre at Malmedy," Rosenberg said during one session. "But you commanded a Tiger tank, 70 tons of steel and firepower. How exactly were you powerless?" The question broke something inside Klaus that had been carefully contained for months. "Because I was a coward," he finally admitted. "I chose my crew's safety over doing what was right. I told myself we couldn't fight our own forces, but the truth is I was afraid to die for strangers." Rosenberg leaned forward. "And what have you learned from that choice?" "That there are things worse than dying," Klaus whispered. "There are things worse than being stopped cold." The interrogation records from Camp Atterbury would later become crucial evidence in post-war trials, not for prosecuting Klaus and his crew, but for understanding how ordinary soldiers became complicit in extraordinary evil. Klaus's testimony helped convict 3 SS officers involved in the Malmedy massacre, but more importantly, it provided insight into the moral collapse that had enabled genocide. In 1947, as Klaus prepared for repatriation, he received an unexpected visitor. Staff Sergeant O'Malley, now a civilian working for the Army's Historical Division, had come to interview German veterans about tank warfare tactics. "I've wondered about you three," O'Malley said. "Whether you made it through." Klaus looked at the American who had accepted their surrender that terrible day in the Ardennes. "We survived," he said carefully. "Whether we made it through, that's a different question." Klaus Müller returned to Bavaria in October 1947, carrying nothing but a cardboard suitcase and the weight of hard-earned wisdom. The Tiger tank factory where he had once trained stood in ruins, its twisted girders reaching toward an empty sky like the bones of some prehistoric beast. The mighty war machine that had terrorized Europe was now scrap metal, melted down to rebuild a broken continent. He found work in a small garage outside Munich, working alongside Hans Zimmer, who had returned 6 months earlier. They rarely spoke of the war, but their shared silence held more understanding than 1,000 words. Both men had learned that true strength wasn't measured in armor thickness or gun caliber, but in the courage to choose humanity when everything else demanded brutality. Eric lived nearby with his wife, who had learned to love the gentle stranger her husband had become. He never regained his speech, but he found peace tending a small garden behind their house. Sometimes Klaus would visit, and the two men would sit quietly among the tomatoes and carrots, watching things grow instead of watching them die. The missing fuel hose that had stopped their Tiger tank cold became, in Klaus's mind, a strange kind of salvation. It had forced them to witness evil, yes, but it had also prevented them from participating in the final, futile battles that claimed so many other tank crews in those last desperate months of the war. Sometimes divine intervention arrives disguised as mechanical failure. In 1949, Klaus received a letter from Technical Sergeant Martinez, now managing a garage in Albuquerque, New Mexico. "Hans told me you're rebuilding engines too," the letter read. "Funny how we all ended up in the same business, taking broken things and making them work again. Maybe that's what the world needs now, mechanics instead of warriors." The letter included a newspaper clipping about a war memorial being built in Bastogne, Belgium, honoring both American and German soldiers who had died in the Ardennes. Klaus never visited the memorial, but he kept the clipping in his wallet until the day he died in 1987, a reminder that even the darkest chapters of history could be transformed into lessons about the price of redemption. If you've been moved by this story of courage, failure, and ultimately redemption in the face of impossible choices, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We're dedicated to bringing you more powerful historical narratives that explore the human side of history's greatest conflicts. Hit that notification bell so you won't miss our upcoming stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. And remember, the most important battles are often fought not with tanks or guns, but with the simple choice to remain human when everything around us demands otherwise. See you in the next video.